I love new gear, probably many of you do as well. A shiny new headphone, DAC, amp, or IEM is enticing, but old products aren't worse than new releases. You can find unique, affordable stuff that's been lost to the sands of audiophile hype and short attention spans. Today, we're taking a look at the Audio-Technica ATH-AD700X. This headphone has been around since at least 2013. It is the lower tier of several related headphone models. Audio-Technica still sells the 700X for an MSRP of $200. You can find a brand new version of the 700X on Amazon for just over $100, however. A subscriber generously sent me the 700X last year. Is this an oldie but goodie, or a headphone best left buried? Audio-Technica calls the 700X, quote, an audiophile open-air headphone. They promise this headphone will reproduce no pressure on the ears because of the open-back nature of the headphones. The 700X supposedly has a completely natural listening experience. The marketing claims that the 53mm drivers in this headphone produce spacious sound with superior highs and mids. Funny enough, Audio-Technica says nothing about the bass reproduction of this headphone. Instead, the claims are specifically about the mids and treble. The marketing says that these two ranges are clearly reproduced. The 700X is near the lower end of a series of related headphones. This includes the 500X, the 900X, and the 2000X. The marketing for all these headphones suggests different sound signatures. The 500X, for example, ostensibly has more bass than the others. The 900X might be more balanced sounding. Audio-Technica sells the $2,000 ATH-AD700X, which has some similarities to the far cheaper headphones I just mentioned. However, the X5000 has different drivers. I have not heard any of these other headphones. The 700X looks weird in photographs, and it doesn't look any less weird when you hold it in front of you. But once you get past the unusual design, there's a lot to unpack here. Audio-Technica uses a mixture of aluminum and plastic in the construction. There's nothing flimsy about this headphone. The grills are aluminum, and they are thick. The ear cups are made of thick plastic. It seems sturdy and covered in matte black. The ear pads are replaceable. There's nothing proprietary about them. However, they are fairly thin. There seems to be generic foam padding in it. These ear pads are also fairly shallow, so you might find that your ears touch the driver housing. The drivers are angled. The ear cups swivel horizontally, however, there is no vertical movement at all. The headband structure is metal with a plastic covering. The yokes are plastic. The 700X has Audio-Technica's wing head support system. This self-adjusts when you put the headphone on. There's very little padding on them. The cable is not detachable. Unfortunately, that's the case for the sister headphones as well. If you know how to solder cables, then you should be able to modify this shortcoming. The cable is about 10 feet long. The 700X does not come with much. You get the headphones and a 1/4-inch adapter. There's no carrying case or spare ear pads. As for comfort, the 700X was surprisingly comfortable for me. I can easily wear this headphone for about 3 to 4 hours before needing a break. My ears do tend to touch the driver housings, but I've never found this painful or distracting. The wing adjustment system works rather well. The headphones do cause a bit of pressure from the wings, but it's no more than with any typical headphone. My hair does not catch on the mechanism, which was a concern I had when I first saw the 700X. Overall, the 700X is built very well. I wish the ear cups had some vertical movement. I'm not a fan of non-detachable cables. It's a real pain to drag 10 feet of cable everywhere. The headphone should come with a carrying bag, spare ear pads, and a detachable cable. The fact that Audio-Technica charges $200 MSRP without all these things is simply astounding to me. I tested the 700X using various devices. This includes my Modi Liquid Spark stack, the Matrix Saber X and RN-HP stack, and my RME ADI2 DAC. I use the stock accessories. I listen to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. The 700X is a 38-ohm headphone with a sensitivity of 100 decibels. Audio-Technica recommends no more than 700 milliwatts. In my experience, the 700X is really easy to drive. I had no trouble powering this headphone with the EcoZerta ITM03, Low 2 PAW S1, or even the headphone output of my LG V30. Adding more power does tend to marginally affect bass response, adding slightly greater sub-bass and mid-bass. However, there is no need to use a powerful amplifier with this headphone. Audio-Technica says nothing about the bass response for the 700X. My tests indicate that this headphone has a bass roll-off. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, neutral headphones will reproduce the sub-bass rumble from beginning to end of this song. The 700X, however, could not fully represent the rumble. This detail had fast transients and even at higher volumes sounded distant. The reverberation was, frankly, de-emphasized. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass was clear. When the crescendo hit at the middle of the song, the organ was clearly separated from the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was barely audible. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were about one step ahead of the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound that pans from right to left to center. The 700X did present the sound of rolling marbles and some of the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the 700X clearly presented all of them. Each had hard impact. There was very little melding between each drum strike. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. With each song, the 700X made the sub-bass under-emphasized. The subwoofer sounded distant, like it was in another room. Drums were louder and fairly obvious. Drum hits were impactful, hard, but not piercing or sharp. Vocals were 2 steps ahead of the bass. I listened to my Sicario playlist. These songs have significant sub-bass emphasis. I try to listen for any audible distortion in the bass region during this test while traversing from low to excessive volumes. The 700X never exhibited any audible bass distortion. Overall, the 700X has a sub-bass roll-off. This is rather obvious. Compared to more neutral-sounding headphones like the Allo Audio S4X or the HD6XX, the 700X makes subwoofer effects distant. Mid-bass, however, is closer to neutral, though not as impactful as with closed-back headphones. Bass clarity is above average. Transients is a bit fast, and at least faster than that of the S4X and the HD6XX. Audio-Technica says that the mids are clear. My tests indicate that the 700X has slightly forward mids with a sibilance emphasis. In Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, vocal grain and sibilance is mixed into the track. The 700X marginally accentuated both details. Vocal grain sounded just a few decibels more obvious on the 700X than what I heard on the Allo S4X. However, sibilance was similar to that of the S4X. Orla's voice was easily 2 steps ahead of the instruments. There was some melding between the drums and the guitar, though the headphone does not make these instruments sound muddy or difficult to separate. In Want You Back by Haim, the 700X again showed that it marginally emphasizes female vocal sibilance. The emphasis was similar to what I heard on the S4X. At 8 seconds into the track, the singers say the word "we" and drag it out, making it sound gravelly. The 700X had no trouble presenting this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists in the song, one in either channel. The 700X perfectly separated all 3 voices initially. When the instruments played at maximum, the voices of the backup vocalists melded into one. However, when the instruments played softly, the separation returned. There was some melding among the drums, piano, guitar, and bass, but no muddiness. The bass seemed distant and sometimes difficult to hear. The vocals were 2 steps ahead of the instruments. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the 700X clearly rendered the ukulele and drums. The bass was audible, but was clearly underemphasized. The primary male singer's voice was 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His vocal sibilance had a very marginal emphasis, almost as much as that of female vocalists. This emphasis was far from harsh or piercing. There's a backup vocalist in this song, and that voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most headphones cannot separate this subtle detail. The 700X could not either. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The 700X perfectly recreated this detail. Overall, the 700X appears to have forward mids. Vocals are generally 2 steps ahead of instruments. There's at least average clarity in the mids region. Vocals are intimate, close to the ears. While there is a sibilance emphasis, the 700X never seemed to sound harsh. Audio-Technica says that the 700X has clear treble. My tests indicate that the treble is neutral or very close to it. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the 700X clearly presented the brass and horns. The nasally signatures of these instruments was obvious. The timpani sounded distant and generally underemphasized. I could hear group sets, but not individual instruments. The 700X has width and depth, but no verticality. In other words, instruments never sounded from above or below, but I did hear instruments closer or further away in the wings and deeper in the well, as if in an orchestra arrangement. In Flight from the City, the 700X made the piano sound like it was 5 feet away. Its bassy notes were underemphasized. There was very little melding among the notes. The cello sounded smooth and distinct from the piano. I could easily hear the pops and sizzles and electric buzzing effects in this track. Moreover, the creaking of wood on the pianist's bench and the shifting of the cello's weight was perfectly audible. The piano and cello sounded fairly close to the ears. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the 700X rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and bass somewhere in the background. There was average separation among these instruments. Their notes did not meld into one muddy signature. Instead, I could concentrate on any one of these instruments and hear its notes. The saxophone sounded clear and was one step ahead of the other instruments. It never sounded piercing. The cymbals are struck at different positions, and that should result in slightly varied tonalities with each strike. The 700X did present some of the various tonalities. Overall, the 700X appears to have close to neutral treble. No instruments sound harsh, even at high volumes. There's at least average separation among treble instruments, resulting in detail and clarity throughout this region. Audio-Technica doesn't say how detailed the 700X is supposed to be. However, my tests indicate that this headphone has at least average clarity and detail. Obvious details are abundantly clear, and some subtle details are easily audible. The 700X is not a detail monster, but it does a very respectable job of separating instruments and allowing you to hear what, frankly, should be heard. For example, twangs of guitar strings, sharp intakes of breaths, multiple vocalists, shifting of a cello's weight, creaking of wood, electric buzzing, pops and sizzles, and nasally signatures of brass instruments are all readily available through this headphone. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of steps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Sennheiser HD800S presents 22 footsteps, the Focal Clear, 18 footsteps. The Austrian Audio Hi-X65 presents 16 to 17. The Hi-X55 presents 16. The Hi-X15 and the X25BT present 13 to 14 footsteps. The Hi-Fi Mansundara, Aventone Planar, Sifka Phoenix, and Berdynamic DT1990 each present 10 to 11. The Monolith M1070, M1570, Sifka Robin, and Ultrasone Pro 1480i all provide about 8 to 9 footsteps. The audeze LCD2 Closed and LCD2 Classic each provide 7 to 8. The M1060C provides 7 footsteps. The audeze LCD1 and the HD6XX present 6 to 7 footsteps. The Neumann NDH20 presents 5 to 6. The 700X provided 9 to 10 footsteps. I use the HD6XX and the LCD1 as my average benchmark. Any headphone that renders more or less footsteps is judged accordingly. Therefore, the NDH20 on my scale has below average detail. The Hi-Fi Mansundara has above average. The HD800S is the king of detail retrieval so far. With this in mind, it is apparent that the 700X is easily above average in the detail category. It easily outshines the NDH20 and is clearer than the LCD2, both of which cost several hundreds of dollars more than the 700X at its MSRP. Just food for thought in case you operate under the belief that paying more gets you more. The 700X, being an open back headphone, should have a wide soundstage, right? It's not that easy though. You have to quantify soundstage, and only then will it make sense. For example, if all you ever listen to is Beats headphones, then nearly anything else in the audiophile market will sound expansive. This is why I have a soundstage scale. Once again, I use the HD6XX and LCD1 as my average performers. Headphones that have more or less soundstage than these two are judged accordingly. The audeze Mobius and all Beats headphones have claustrophobic soundstage. The NDH20 and the ATH-M60X have below average soundstage. The HD6XX and LCD1 have average soundstage. The Sivka Phoenix, Emotiva GR1, and Ultrasone Pro 1480i have average to maybe above average soundstage, depending on the particular recording. The Hi-Fi Man Sundara, Avantone Planar, Austrian Audio Hi X55, and the X65, and the LCD2 Classic have above average soundstage. The Hi-Fi Man Diva has wide soundstage. The ATH-AD700X has super wide soundstage. The 700X has slightly above average soundstage. It's not quite as wide as the Sundara, but neither is it like the HD6XX. The fascinating thing about the 700X is its ability to render instruments in depth and width. That's an aspect of soundstage presentation that often gets overlooked. It's nice if a headphone has wide soundstage, but it's downright impressive if you can hear instruments placed differently along the soundstage spectrum. The 700X has the ability to present instruments or vocalists closer or further away in depth and width. Of course, this will depend on your recording. A track recorded in mono, then published in stereo, is not exactly the benchmark to test this. So if you're going to test your own gear, check your recordings. Audio-Technica doesn't say much about the performance and sound of the 700X. Consequently, you have very little idea what to expect from reading the marketing. You might get the impression that 700X is bass anemic, but I don't think that's really true. Yes, this headphone will not please people who like big thumping bass, but this headphone is not lacking bass. Instead, think of it just not neutral rendition. There's a difference. The 700X has an obvious sub-bass roll-off. Reverberation is fast, faster than that of the neutral Allo Audio S4X. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is fairly clear. Mid-bass impact is hard, but not sharp. The S4X has longer reverberation and slightly harder impact. There is very little bass bleed into the mids. The mids are forward. Vocals typically appear 2 steps ahead of instruments. There's a slight emphasis of vocal grain and sibilance, but this is nowhere close to the sibilance you will hear on the HD560S. In fact, the sibilance is more obvious on the LCD1 than on the 700X. There is some melding among mid-centric instruments, but no muddiness. You can generally hear all instruments and concentrate on any one if you so choose. Treble seems to be fairly neutral and clear. The 700X never sounded harsh or piercing, even at high volumes. Treble instruments have good separation among each other, resulting in details being easy to hear. Detail retrieval and soundstage is above average. In my view, the 700X is a mid-centric headphone. I'm not suggesting that the bass is missing. You can hear sub-bass and mid-bass, but you may want more of it. Pop, rock, jazz, classical, orchestral, spoken word, all of these genres work rather well on this headphone, I think. Whether you end up liking it is something only you can decide. On my channel, we compare products. We do real A/B tests to figure out how products sound and whether there are any notable differences among them. Today's hype product will be tomorrow's regretful purchase. So the more precise information you have, the better. We will compare the 700X against the HD6XX, the LCD1, and the Sivka Phoenix. I use the stock accessories for all these headphones. I plugged them into my passive AB switch, which was plugged into my RME ADI2 DAC, and the Matrix Saber X and RNHP stack. I tried to volume match. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. The 6XX has greater bass emphasis than the 700X. The 6XX tends to have more sub-bass, longer reverberation, and considerably greater melding between sub-bass and mid-bass. Bass clarity is more obvious on the 700X. Mid-bass impact is slightly harder on the 6XX. The mids sound a bit more intimate on the 6XX. All instruments and vocals sound a little bit closer to the ears on the 6XX. Separation among mid-centric elements is clearer on the 700X. The 700X has a marginal emphasis in vocal grain and sibilance, while the 6XX tends to keep both details closer to neutral. The 6XX has greater melding among all mid-centric elements. There's also more bass bleed into the mids on the 6XX. Treble is fairly closely related on these headphones. Both seem to have close to neutral or neutral treble. Neither makes recordings sound harsh. However, the 700X has more treble clarity, more separation among treble instruments, and a bit more separation of instruments from your ears. The 6XX is more intimate, in other words. The 700X has greater detail and clarity and wider soundstage than the 6XX. The LCD1 and the 700X have similar sub-bass response. Both have a roll-off. This seems to be nearly to the same amount. However, the LCD-1 has slightly longer reverberation than the 700X. There's also noticeably greater melding between sub-bass and mid-bass on the LCD-1. Mid-bass impact is nearly identical. If I had to guess, I would say that the LCD-1 has ever so slightly harder impact. The mids are differently presented. Vocals are more intimate on the LCD-1. The LCD-1 has more emphasis of vocal grain, and sibilance emphasis is slightly higher too. There's a bit more clarity and separation of mid-centric elements on the 700X. Treble is not the same. The LCD-1 has a treble roll-off, particularly in the upper treble region. The 700X, in comparison, is closer to neutral. The LCD-1 presents all instruments a little closer to the ears. The 700X has greater separation among treble instruments. The 700X has wider soundstage, greater detail, clarity, and separation than the LCD-1. The Phoenix has greater bass emphasis than the 700X. The Phoenix has closer to neutral sub-bass and mid-bass rendition. The 700X has obviously greater separation of sub-bass from mid-bass and more bass clarity. Mid-bass impact is a little harder on the Phoenix. There's more bass bleed into the mids on the Phoenix. Bass transience was faster on the 700X. The mids are a little different between these headphones. Both headphones emphasize vocal sibilance. The Phoenix has a tiny bit more of it. However, the 700X also emphasizes vocal grain. Separation of mid-centric elements is more obvious on the 700X. The Phoenix has a more intimate presentation, making everything sound a little bit closer to the ears. The Phoenix and 700X seem to have a similar amount of treble energy. The Phoenix placed instruments closer to the ears than the 700X. There was more separation among treble instruments on the 700X. If I had to guess, I would say that the Phoenix probably has just a tiny bit more treble presentation, more treble energy in other words, than the 700X. The 700X has wider soundstage than the Phoenix. The Phoenix does not have width and depth like the 700X does. Both headphones have a similar amount of detail retrieval, but the 700X presents the same details more clearly. I have said this many times, I love doing comparisons. You start to appreciate differences among gear when you do true A/B tests. Sometimes you figure out why you like one headphone or IEM more than another, which could further help you determine where, if at all, you want to spend your money. And A/B tests repeatedly show us that there is rarely any difference among DACs and amps despite popular misguided and uninformed belief among audiophiles. Here, whilst comparing these four headphones, we discovered that the 700X is no slouch. Of all options here, the 700X consistently was the clearest of them all. And, except for the Phoenix, the 700X presented greater detail retrieval than its competitors. Of course, technicalities aside, all four headphones have different sound signatures. The 700X, for example, has the least amount of bass emphasis but the most amount of bass clarity. The 6XX is the most neutral sounding of the four. The LCD-1 is the most dark sounding, most intimate of the four. The Phoenix is the most balanced sounding of the four. The 700X, along with all these competitors, might cater to your taste. Or, this might not be your particular cup of tea. Whatever your preferences happen to be, there is no such thing as an objectively best headphone or IEM or DAC or amp. You just have to figure out what works for you. I was a little bit surprised with the 700X. It's a goofy looking headphone and it costs $200 if you buy it directly from Technica. This wouldn't be the first headphone I'd jump to try had I not heard it already. The 700X has some things you might not like. For example, the non-detachable cable. I dislike this tethered design, especially from audiophile companies. It's an old school excuse for pushing new school audiophiles higher up the price ladder. It's inexcusable. The overall build of the 700X is fairly good, but the shallow ear pads will result in some people feeling discomfort. Your ears might touch the driver housing. The headband wing adjustment system is somewhat fragile. If you break one of the wings, you're out of luck. Depending on the damage, you might not be able to glue the wings back if you break it. On the other hand, I've had this headphone for probably just about a year, and I've never seen any damage to the wings or any other part of this headphone despite tossing it around. The 700X comes with no meaningful accessories. For all intents and purposes, you get nothing but the headphones. And in 2022, that's a hard pill to swallow. We've seen sub-$100 headphones consistently provide a lot for the price, including spare ear pads, protective cases, and other amenities. The 700X has a mid-centric sound. The bass is rolled off, though not missing. It's simply not going to please everybody. The 700X has above-average clarity and detail, above-average separation of elements, and above-average soundstage. This headphone has a bit of vocal grain and sibilance emphasis, but nothing that sounds remotely as harsh as the HD560S. The treble is close to neutral and clear. Does this amount to a $200 value proposition? No, I don't think so. I'm sorry, but the $200 MSRP is a little silly. The utter lack of accessories and non-detachable cable is a huge letdown. You can't predict if you will like this headphone sound signature, but you might be able to reason yourself into keeping it if it had modern amenities. The fact that you'll always drag along a 10-foot cable and be subject to carefully using it because of its wing adjustment system and lack of protective case are issues you just can't ignore. It's short-sightedness or greed from Audio-Technica, and I don't think people should pay $200 for this company's mistakes. On the other hand, if you find this headphone for around $100, I think it's definitely value. Yeah, you still have to deal with the lengthy cable and non-existent accessories, but it's far easier to excuse these limitations when you've just saved yourself $100. Ultimately, my value judgment is based entirely upon where and for how much you find these headphones. If you can only find them for the MSRP and you want to try them out, then make sure that the retailer has a generous return and refund policy. If you found it for around $100, then I think it is worth serious consideration.